Main streets across rural Wisconsin tell a quiet but unmistakable story. Storefronts that once housed hardware stores, cafes, and family repair shops now sit empty or repurposed. School enrollments fall. Churches merge congregations, and young adults leave for work in larger cities, rarely returning. These changes are often blamed on vague forces like progress or globalization. But in Wisconsin, the most important cause is the collapse of the small family dairy farm, and the consolidation of milk production into a shrinking number of much larger operations. Far from being a neutral evolution, this shift has stripped small towns of their economic engines, hollowed out the rural middle class, and weakened the state as a whole. In the middle of the 20th century, Wisconsin's countryside was dotted with small family farms run by a single person, a couple, or a family, milking modest herds and earning most of their income from that work. Today, only a small fraction of those farms remain, even though Wisconsin still produces enormous volumes of milk. The same work that once supported many independent households is now concentrated in far fewer, much larger operations. Economists call this consolidation, the concentration of production and ownership into fewer, bigger businesses, with many small farms going out of business along the way. For decades, small dairies anchored a dense web of jobs, local businesses, and community institutions. When a family farm disappears, spending that once flowed through nearby feed mills, repair shops, banks, schools, and churches is reduced or redirected to larger centers. Over time, repeated losses of this kind erode the tax base, undermine main street businesses, and leave rural institutions struggling to survive. This essay argues that consolidation of dairy farms into fewer, larger operations is not the natural course of progress, but a destructive process that has done enormous harm to small-town Wisconsin. By tracing how dairy has changed, how these changes have reshaped jobs and community life, and what alternatives exist, it makes the case that any serious effort to revive the rural Midwest must put the survival of family-scale farming at the center rather than treating it as a relic of the past. Section 2, Wisconsin as America's Dairyland. From many small farms to very few. In the mid-20th century, Wisconsin truly was America's Dairyland. Around 1950, the state had roughly 143,000 dairy farms. By 1960, there were still about 105,000, most of them small family operations run by a single person or a couple and relying on milk sales for most of their income. Dairy production was highly decentralized, with tens of thousands of independent businesses spread across nearly every rural township. Over the next few decades, that structure collapsed. By the late 1960s, the dairy farm count had fallen to around 60,000. By 1980, it was roughly 44,000, and by 1990, it had dropped again into the range of 20,000 to just over 30,000, depending on the source and the definition used. In roughly 30 years, Wisconsin lost well over half of its dairy farms, and the remaining operations were, on average, milking more cows than before. The decline accelerated in the 2000s and 2010s. Wisconsin repeatedly led the nation in dairy farm closures, and by the early 2020s, the number of licensed dairy farms had fallen below 6,000. In 2024, the state recorded roughly 5,600 to 5,700 dairy farms, compared with about 105,000 in 1960. This represents a loss of more than 95% of the state's dairies. For every 20 farms that were milking cows in 1960, only about one is still in business today. Yet Wisconsin remains one of the country's top dairy producers. What has changed is how concentrated that production has become. Cow numbers and milk output make this clear. In the 1960s, Wisconsin had roughly 2.1 to 2.3 million milk cows. In recent years, the herd has been closer to 1.25 to 1.3 million cows. Over the same period, total milk production actually rose from about 17 to 18 billion pounds per year in 1960 to roughly 30 to 32 billion pounds per year in the early 2020s. Fewer cows and far fewer farms now produce significantly more milk than a generation generation or two ago. That is only possible because average herd size and productivity per cow have grown dramatically. Where a county once might have had dozens of 60 to 100 cow dairies, it may now have a handful of operations with 500, 1,000, or several thousand cows each. On spreadsheets, this pattern is often described as efficiency or modernization. In practice, it means that production, ownership, and decision-making have been pulled away from thousands of family businesses and concentrated in a narrow group of large farms and the processors and lenders that serve them. The shift from about 143,000 dairy farms in 1950 and 105,000 in 1960 to fewer than 6,000 today, alongside a near doubling of milk output, is the clearest numerical expression of how extreme that consolidation has been. Section 3. Small family dairy farms as economic engines in rural Wisconsin. For most of the last century, small family dairy farms were not just cultural symbols in Wisconsin, they were one of the state's core economic engines. Dairy functions as a cluster, a set of linked activities built around the farm that produces raw milk. Before and after the milk leaves the farm, money flows through seed and fertilizer dealers, feed mills, veterinarians, milk truck drivers, cheese plants, and the stores that sell dairy products. When there are many farms scattered across a region, this cluster touches many different towns and supports a wide middle layer of independent business and workers. Recent studies show how large this cluster still is in dollar terms. The combined dairy sector in Wisconsin, including farms, processors, and related businesses, generates roughly $52 to $53 billion in industrial revenues in a single year, about 6.5% of all economic output in the state. It supports roughly 120,000 to 121,000 jobs, or around 1 in every 30 jobs. Dairy alone accounts for almost half of all agricultural activity in Wisconsin. Even after decades of farm loss, dairy remains one of the central pillars of the state's economy. Within this broader cluster, dairy farms themselves account for about $15.2 billion in annual revenue. They support close to 49,000 jobs and generate about $2.6 billion in labor income, meaning wages, salaries, and owner compensation. When total household income is counted, including business profits, dairy farm activity is connected to roughly $5.2 billion flowing into Wisconsin households. These numbers show that what happens to dairy farms directly affects tens of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in income. Because so few farms remain, it is possible to see how much economic activity is attached to each operation. In recent years, Wisconsin has had between about 5,200 and 5,700 licensed dairy farms. If we divide the roughly 120,700 dairy-linked jobs by about 5,200 farms, each farm is associated, on average, with about 23 jobs across the cluster, including on-farm work, processing, transportation, suppliers, and the spending that ripples through local economies. Doing the same with the $7.9 billion in labor income tied to the cluster gives roughly $1.5 million in labor income per farm. Looking only at the farm side, the 48,800 farm-related jobs divided across about 5,200 farms suggests that each operation is directly or closely connected to about 9 or 10 jobs. These are averages, and large farms account for more of those jobs than small ones, but they give a clear sense of the economic weight each remaining dairy farm carries. A typical 100-cow dairy illustrates how this plays out in small towns. University farm budgets for Wisconsin show that the annual cost of producing milk can easily exceed $4,000 per cow once feed, bedding, veterinary care, fuel, repairs, and hired labor are included. For a 100-cow herd, that translates into hundreds of thousands of dollars in yearly purchases. Much of that spending goes to nearby businesses. The local feed mill that grinds grain and delivers rations. The seed dealer and agronomist who support crop production. The large animal veterinarian and dairy nutritionist. The equipment dealer, mechanic, and welder. And the milk truck driver who stops at the farm every day or two. Local cooperatives, banks, insurance agencies, and accounting firms also depend on a critical mass of farm customers. When many such farms operate in a region, their combined spending sustains a dense network of rural businesses. On top of business purchases, dairy farm families support the rural middle class through their household income and community involvement. National data show the average farm household now earns close to $100,000 per year, but only around $20,000 comes directly from farming, with the majority from off-farm work. Even so, the farm's existence often makes that off-farm income possible, as one spouse works in town while the other runs the farm, or hired workers live and spend money locally. Farm families buy groceries, school supplies, building materials, and vehicles. They pay property taxes that support schools and local government, and participate in churches, civic groups, and youth organizations. When Wisconsin had around 100,000 dairy farms, there were 100,000 separate centers of decision-making and spending power distributed across the countryside. Each one was a small business employing family members and neighbors, buying from local firms and contributing to local tax bases. As consolidation has reduced that number to a few thousand farms, the structure of the dairy economy has shifted away from many small, locally rooted enterprises and toward fewer, larger operations. Statewide figures for milk production and economic output still look impressive, but beneath them, the broad foundation of independent, middle-class farm families has thinned, leaving many small towns struggling to sustain businesses, schools, and community institutions. Section 4. Why small family farms are disappearing. The disappearance of small family dairy farms in Wisconsin is often described as modernization or market forces, as if it were a neutral form of progress. In reality, it is driven by economic pressures, policy choices, and structural changes that systematically favor larger operations. These forces do not just rearrange who produces milk, they push family farms out of business and concentrate production into fewer hands. A major driver is the long-term squeeze between milk prices and production costs. The price farmers receive for their milk, called the farm gate price, has been volatile for decades, and in many years hovers at or below the cost of production for small and mid-sized farms. In the late 2010s, many Wisconsin dairy farmers were being paid around $16 per hundredweight of milk. One detailed report described a multi-generational 45-cow dairy receiving roughly this price while facing fixed costs that included a $2,100 monthly mortgage, along with feed, repairs, and utilities. At that price, the family could not cover the full costs or plan for the future. University budgets showed that once feed, labor, interest, and overhead are included, typical dairies often need milk prices above $20 per hundredweight just to meet basic financial goals. When prices crash or stagnate, while feed, fertilizer, fuel, and machinery costs rise, small farms with limited reserves and borrowing power are pushed into chronic loss and eventually forced to sell their herds. Policy and market structure deepens this squeeze. Federal milk pricing rules, known as milk marketing orders, were designed in an earlier era and have not kept up with current market reality. They tend to favor large processors and do little to protect farm-level incomes during periods of oversupply. Trade policies and the push for export markets encourages high production nationally, contributing to surplus milk that drags down prices. Weak antitrust enforcement has allowed concentration among processors, cooperatives, and retailers, so a small number of companies dominate processing and grocery sales. These buyers are better positioned to push down the price they pay for raw milk and capture more of the consumer dollar. Small farmers selling a perishable product that must move quickly have almost no bargaining power. They are price takers who cannot store milk and wait for better terms, so the risks of price crashes fall heavily on them, while large processors and retailers are better able to protect their margins. Technological change has also fueled consolidation, but not because technology is inherently harmful, but because it has been adopted in ways that reward scale. Over the last 40 years, advances in breeding, milking equipment, barn design, and herd management have enabled farms to milk many more cows with fewer people. In 1987, half of all U.S. milk cows were on farms with 80 cows or fewer. By 2017, the midpoint herd size had grown to about 1,300 cows, more than a tenfold increase in 3 decades. Very large farms can spread the cost of rotary parlors, computerized feeding systems, and manure handling equipment over many more cows, lowering the average cost per unit of milk and making it easier to survive in low-price periods. Small family farms may adopt some new tools, but their scale limits how far they can push costs down. In a market that rewards the lowest cost per unit above all else, The farm size that best supports local communities are systematically disadvantaged. Debt and the pressure to get big or get out add another layer. For decades, policy and industry advice have urged farmers to expand herds, build new barns, and take on loans to stay competitive. For a 60 or 80 cow dairy, the message has been clear: add cows or risk being left behind. Many families borrowed heavily to expand. When milk prices fell, those debts became a crushing burden. Large farms with more equity and closer ties to lenders and processors were better able to renegotiate terms or ride out the bad years. Smaller farms that expanded at the wrong time or were hit by several bad years in a row often had no choice but to sell. The buyer was frequently a larger neighboring farm or outside investor, reinforcing the pattern of consolidation. Demographic change compounds these pressures. The average age of farmers in Wisconsin and across the United States is now in the late 50s or early 60s. Younger generations often see little reason to take over a small dairy that demands long hours and heavy physical work while offering high financial risk and low or uncertain returns. National statistics show that most farm household income now comes from off-farm jobs, with only a minority earned directly from farming. Many younger family members already have skills and careers elsewhere. When older farmers retire or can no longer manage the demands of dairying, there may be no successor. Land may be sold or rented to larger dairies that fold it into much bigger herds or, more often, converted to lower labor crops such as corn and soybeans. In both cases, the number of independent dairy businesses shrinks, and another community anchor is lost. Low and volatile milk prices skewed policy and market structures, technology that rewards scale, heavy debt loads, and aging farm populations all interact to drive consolidation. None of those forces, however, make consolidation inevitable. They operate within a policy and market framework that could have been designed differently, and that can still be changed. As long as that framework rewards volume and low farm gate prices over the survival of family farms, however, small dairies will continue to disappear and production will continue to concentrate in fewer, larger operations. Section 5. Job losses and income impacts from dairy farm consolidation. The consolidation of dairy farms in Wisconsin is not just a numerical decline in farm count. Each closing farm takes with it a cluster of jobs, income, and local spending that once supported small-town economies. When tens of thousands of small family dairies vanish, the loss is felt not only by the farmers themselves, but also by truck drivers, veterinarians, technicians, plant workers, and local business owners whose livelihoods depend on farm activity whether they know it or not. As shown earlier, Wisconsin went from roughly 105,000 dairy farms in 1960 to about 5,600 or 5,700 today, while annual milk production rose from around 17.8 billion pounds to nearly 32 billion pounds. More than 99,000 dairy farms have disappeared, yet the state produces far more milk than it did in 1960. The work has not vanished. It has been consolidated into far fewer, much larger operations. The key question for rural communities is how many jobs and how much income were tied to those missing farms, and where that economic weight has gone. Economic impact studies show that Wisconsin's dairy cluster generates about $52.8 billion in industrial revenues and supports roughly 120,700 jobs. Dairy farms themselves account for about $15.2 billion in revenues, around 48,800 jobs, $2.6 billion in labor income, and $5.2 billion in total household income. Spread across roughly 52 to 5,700 farms, these figures mean that each remaining dairy farm is associated on average with about 23 jobs across the broader cluster and roughly $1.5 million in labor income, with 9 or 10 of those jobs closely tied to the farm itself. These are just averages rather than precise counts for any single operation, but they show how much work and income each farm represents. Applying these averages to recent farm losses reveals the scale. Between the mid-2010s and early 2020s, Wisconsin's dairy farm count fell from around 8,000 to about 5,500, a loss of roughly 2,500 farms. Using the estimate of 23 cluster jobs per farm, those farms were linked to about 57,000 jobs. Using the $1.5 million labor income estimate, that means they were tied to roughly $3.7 billion in wages and salaries. Not all of these jobs and dollars vanished. Some shifted to surviving farms and processors. But many positions that once existed in small towns attached to small farms were just eliminated, or moved to larger, more centralized workplaces in bigger communities. communities. The result is fewer independent business owners and fewer jobs in the smallest villages, even though total dairy employment in the state remains large on paper. Looking over the full 6-decade consolidation, the long-term loss of roughly 99,000 farms implies an enormous pool of work that has been redistributed or erased entirely. Each of those farms once supported feed mill workers, milk haulers, small cheese plant employees, mechanics, local bank and cooperative staff whose work depended heavily on farm business. As these farms disappeared, those jobs were more likely to shrink, consolidate, or relocate. Over time, consolidation has translated into a much thinner layer of employment across most of rural Wisconsin. The income effects reach beyond direct payrolls. Every dollar of dairy farm income turns over several times in nearby towns as farm families and workers buy groceries, pay rent, and eat at local cafes. When a farm closes, that multiplier chain breaks. The owner no longer buys thousands of dollars of feed from the local mill. The milk truck stops coming. The family no longer buys breakfast at the diner after morning milking. Repeated closures of this kind lead to shuttered diners, consolidated feed mills, and declining school enrollments as families move to follow jobs elsewhere. Real-world reporting from the Midwest confirms this pattern. Counties with heavy farm consolidation tend to lose not only farms, but also banks, implement dealers, and Main Street retailers. Large farms often purchase inputs from national suppliers or online vendors, bypassing local stores. Fewer farmers on the land mean fewer children in schools, fewer participants in churches and community organizations, and more empty storefronts. Consolidation has not eliminated work in dairy, but it has moved much of that work and income away from small towns and away from the independent family businesses that once anchored them. Section 6, Case Studies. How consolidation reshapes Wisconsin communities. The numbers that describe dairy consolidation can seem abstract until they are connected to actual farms and towns. In Wisconsin, the crisis of small family dairies is visible in the lives of families pushed to the edge. In counties where industrial-scale dairies have replaced smaller operations, and in a few communities that have tried to rebuild after their traditional farm base was eroded. These examples show that consolidation is not a neutral business adjustment. It pushes families into impossible situations, concentrates power, and forces small towns to either reinvent themselves or accept their own decline. One widely reported example is the Rieckmann family dairy near Fremont, which has been in the same family for nearly 2 centuries. Mary and John Rieckmann and their sons milk about 45 cows on land that has supported cows and people for generations. In recent years, the farm has carried roughly $300,000 of debt, much of it taken on just to stay afloat. At the same time, the price they receive for milk has fallen to about $16 per hundredweight, roughly 40% less than 6 years earlier. There are weeks when the entire milk check goes straight to a $2,100 monthly mortgage, with nothing left for feed repairs or family needs. The Rieckmanns hoped to pass the farm on to their son. Instead, they focus on making it through the month. Their story unfolded as Wisconsin's herd count fell to about 8,110 milk cow herds in early 2019, a drop of nearly 700 herds in just 1 year, illustrating how many families faced similar pressure. When a farm like the Rieckmanns finally stops milking cows, the consequences ripple outward. The cows are usually sold to larger farms that fold them into herds of hundreds or thousands. Milk keeps flowing into the supply chain, but the independent business that bought feed, veterinary care, and supplies in the local community is gone. The land may be rented or sold to larger operations, further concentrating control. Family members often take wage jobs in nearby factories or service businesses, spending more of their time and money in larger towns instead of the closest village. In the short term, this looks like efficiency. Fewer owners manage more cows. In the long term, each closure thins the layer of independent farm families who sustained rural schools, churches, and Main Street businesses. At the community level, the pattern is stark in places where many small dairies have been replaced by clusters of large industrial operations. Kewaunee County in northeastern Wisconsin is a clear example. A few decades ago, dairy production there was carried out by many smaller farms. Over time, that landscape shifted into what residents call CAFO Alley, referring to concentrated animal feeding operations that confine more than 1,000 animal units. The number of these operations in Kewaunee County grow from 2 in the early 2000s to about 16 by the middle of the next decade. One dairy is permitted to keep around 8,000 cows. County figures show that the 16 CAFOs contribute most of the more than 555 million gallons of liquid manure spread on fields every year. Analyses estimate that 14 dairy CAFOs and 1 beef CAFO in the county produce as much waste as nearly 925,000 people. This waste is stored in open lagoons and spread on fields, where it can seep into the shallow fractured limestone that underlies much of the county. Investigations have documented serious environmental and public health consequences. A significant share of private wells in Kewaunee County are contaminated with bacteria and nitrates linked to manure spreading, making tap water unsafe in many rural homes there. Residents describe the constant smell of liquid manure, the stress of wondering whether their water is safe, and the feeling that their countryside has become a waste zone for distant dairy processors and urban consumers. At the same time, the number of independent farms and farm-related businesses in the county has declined. Small dairies that once sold milk to local plants and bought supplies from local dealers have been replaced by fewer, larger operations that often buy from national suppliers and rely on specialized service providers. The county still produces a great deal of milk, but the economic benefits are more concentrated, while the costs in polluted wells and reduced quality of life are spread across many households. Not every Wisconsin town has simply accepted decline. A few have tried to rebuild their economies after losing major farm-related employers, often by creating new kinds of food and farm businesses. Viroqua, a town of about 4,400 people in Vernon County, is a widely cited example. In the late 20th century, Viroqua lost one of its largest industrial employers and faced competition from a new Walmart on the edge of town, while surrounding farms dealt with these same consolidation pressures as the rest of the state. Local lenders chose to organize around the region's remaining strengths, especially its concentration of smaller organic and grass-based farms. Vernon County now has more than 200 organic farms, one of the highest densities in the state. A centerpiece of Viroqua's response is the Food Enterprise Center, a 100,000 square foot former factory that sat empty after its previous tenant left. Rather than let it decay, the local Economic Development Association turned it into a multi-tenant hub for food businesses. By the mid-2010s, the center housed around 20 food manufacturers, including a fermented foods company, a snack producer, a maple syrup business, and a regional coffee roaster, together employing roughly 60 to 65 people. The project was financed in part through a $1.8 million bond assembled by 5 local banks. At the same time, Viroqua cultivated a reputation as a small-town food destination. Its main street features a food co-op, cafes, and restaurants focused on locally grown products, earning it the label "the town that beat Walmart" because it found a way to coexist with the big box store by offering something that it could not: locally rooted food culture tied directly to nearby farms. Viroqua's experience does not contradict the argument that consolidation is harmful. It shows how much effort is required to rebuild once the base of small family farms erodes. The town's relative success rests on assets many communities lack, such as a high concentration of organic farms, a network of local banks willing to finance a risky redevelopment, and committed civic leadership over decades. Even then, the Food Enterprise Center's 60 or so jobs do not replace the hundreds of independent farm businesses that once dotted that countryside. Most Wisconsin towns, especially those without tourist appeal or niche farm clusters, have not been able to mount such a response. Their main streets more often resemble the boarded-up storefronts and shrinking school districts that mark the broader pattern of consolidation. Taken together, these case studies show what consolidation looks like on the ground. At the level of a single family, it creates intolerable financial strain and forces people like the Rieckmanns to choose between heritage and survival. At the level of a county, it replaces many small farms with a few industrial dairies that concentrate economic power and generate serious environmental risks. At the level of a town, it leaves communities scrambling to invent entirely new economic strategies if they want to avoid decline. Wisconsin still produces vast quantities of milk, and a few places like Viroqua have created new opportunities around food and farming, but the overall pattern is one of lost farms, lost middle-class livelihoods, and growing distance between the centers of dairy production and the small towns that once depended on family-scale dairy. Section 7. Consequences for the rural, middle class, and community institutions. The consolidation of dairy farms into fewer, larger operations is not just an agricultural trend. It is a direct blow to the rural middle class and to the institutions that hold small communities together. For most of the 20th century, a small family dairy farm in Wisconsin was more than a workplace. It was a source of independent income, a place where wealth was built through land and livestock, and a base from which families supported local schools, churches, cooperatives, and civic groups. As that structure is dismantled and replaced by a landscape dominated by a handful of large farms and distant processors, rural life shifts from many independent owners to more wage workers commuting to larger towns. Fewer people have the resources and stability to sustain the institutions that make small-town life possible for everyone. Economically, consolidation pushes families away from asset-based livelihoods and toward dependence on off-farm wages. National data show that in recent years, the median farm household has earned more than $100,000 per year in total. Yet the median income from farming itself has been negative. In 2024, median farm income was about negative $1,830, while median off-farm income was around $86,900. Other analysis found that only about 23% of farm household income in 2023 came from farming, with 77% from non-farm work. For most families, the farm no longer pays its own way. One or more members must work as teachers, nurses, factory workers, or in other jobs just to keep the farm going. Consolidation intensifies this pattern by squeezing out farms that once supported a household and concentrating profits in fewer larger operations. The rural middle class became less a class of independent owners and more of a class of commuters whose economic fate is tied to employers outside their own town. Schools feel this shift quickly. Farm families have long been a major source of enrollment, tax support, and volunteers. As small dairies disappear and younger generations move away, rural districts face fewer students and shrinking budgets. In Wisconsin, statewide K-12 enrollment has fallen by about 75,000 students over the last 25 years, a decline of nearly 10%. With rural districts hit especially hard. Between 2000 and 2010, 182 of 220 rural districts lost students year over year. Because school funding is heavily based on per-pupil counts, fewer students means less money, even though the cost of operating buildings and buses remains the same or increases. Lawmakers have responded by proposing incentives for district consolidation, offering thousands of dollars per student if districts merge or share grades. For rural communities, this often means school closures, longer bus rides, and the loss of one of the last large employers and gathering places in town. Churches and civic organizations experience similar erosion. In many Midwestern towns, congregations were built around farm families who attended weekly services, taught Sunday school, and supported parish finances. When those families sell their cows and move away, pews empty and donations decline. Volunteer fire departments, 4-H clubs, FFA chapters, and local cooperatives all depend on people who have both economic stability and long-term roots in that area. Farmers and rural residents across the upper Midwest describe consolidation as emptying the landscape of farmers and creating a trickle-down impact on schools, churches, and Main Street businesses. The result is not only fewer economic opportunities, but also the unraveling of the social fabric that once bound communities together. On Main Streets, the effects are visible in closed storefronts and shrinking customer bases. When dozens of small farms surround a town, cafe and hardware store owners can count on regular business from farm families who come in after milking, buy parts between chores, and attend school events. When most of the cows belong to one or two large dairies, that steady flow dries up immediately. Studies of farm trends in the Great Plains and Midwest show that as farms consolidate into fewer, larger operations, small town Main Streets lose customers and many businesses close. Large farms often outgrow local service capacity and buy directly from regional or national suppliers. People who remain in depopulating rural areas are left with a narrow range of services, often limited to gas stations, dollar stores, and convenience outlets. The human cost shows up in mental health statistics. Wisconsin dairy farmers facing low milk prices, heavy debt, and unrelenting workloads report feeling overwhelmed and hopeless. Reporting has documented families who expanded their herds to stay competitive, then found themselves working 12 or 13-hour days under crushing financial pressure only to lose a son or brother to suicide. State health officials have described a farmer suicide crisis. In 2015, the suicide rate for farmers in Wisconsin was at least 2.5 times greater than that of the general population. Programs like the Farmer Wellness Helpline now offer 24-hour support, but they treat symptoms of a deeper problem. A system that relentlessly consolidates farms, pushes families to get big or get out, and strips away their economic independence inevitably generates intense stress and despair. All of these consequences reinforce each other. As consolidation reduces the number of independent farm families, there are fewer children in schools, fewer congregants in churches, fewer volunteers for civic organizations, and fewer customers for Main Street businesses. That makes rural communities less attractive for remaining young people, who see limited opportunities and leave for cities or larger towns. Their departure further erodes the tax base and social network, prompting more calls to consolidate schools and services. The outcome is a rural landscape that still produces enormous quantities of milk and other commodities, but with far fewer middle-class families and far weaker community institutions than just a generation ago. Consolidation may produce cheaper milk in some years and impressive output statistics, but it does so by sacrificing the very communities that dairy once built. Section 8. Complications and counter-arguments. Any honest account of dairy consolidation and rural decline in Wisconsin has to admit that the picture is not perfectly uniform. Some rural areas are growing, and large dairies and processors do create jobs and invest in new facilities. Wisconsin's rural population actually increased by about 5.1% between 2000 and 2022, the second highest rural growth rate in the Midwest, even as the region's rural population as a whole declined. Nearly 1/3 of the state's non-metropolitan counties still lost population. However, and most of the growth occurred in tourism and recreation hubs in the North Woods, and in exurban areas near growing cities. National research shows a similar pattern. Rural counties with high amenities such as lakes and forests have attracted new residents, while traditional farm counties have struggled. Since 2020, rural areas nationwide have seen a small net population gain driven by people moving in from urban areas, but this migration has favored scenic and recreational regions more than dairy-dependent townships. It is also true that large dairies and processors are major economic players. As discussed earlier, state-supported research finds that Wisconsin's dairy industry contributes about $52.8 billion per year to the state economy, accounts for roughly 45% of all agricultural industrial revenues, and supports around 120,700 jobs and $7.9 billion in labor income. Much of this impact now comes from processing, distribution, and related services located in larger towns and cities such as Green Bay and Milwaukee. Cheese plants and other processors regularly announce multi-million-dollar expansions that add dozens of jobs and allow them to purchase more milk. These investments help explain why statewide dairy numbers remain impressive even as small farms disappear. The crucial issue is where those jobs and benefits are concentrated. Large dairies and processors are more likely than small family farms to buy inputs from regional or national suppliers, negotiate directly with large companies, and rely on specialized service providers located in bigger centers. The spending and decision-making that once ran through many small towns is increasingly pulled toward regional hubs. Non-farm forces also contribute to small town decline. Big box retail, online shopping, and the consolidation of hospitals and colleges have all shifted commerce and services away from smaller communities. Younger adults across the Midwest often move to cities in search of professional opportunities and amenities, not only because family farms are stressed. Census reviews of Midwestern population change document large shifts from rural to metropolitan counties within states. USDA reports note that the recent uptick in rural population is driven entirely by net migration, not by higher birth rates, and that counties with strong natural amenities or proximity to growing cities gain more than farm-dependent counties. Taken together, these facts complicate but do not overturn the central argument. They show that consolidation does not produce uniform decline across every rural place in Wisconsin. It concentrates harm in farm and manufacturing towns that once formed the backbone of the rural middle class, while some recreational and exurban areas grow. They show that large dairies and processors do generate substantial economic activity, but that the jobs and income they create are increasingly located in larger centers rather than in small communities that small family farms once sustained. They show that retail service and demographic changes matter, but that they interact with and often amplify the damage caused when tens of thousands of small farms vanish. Wisconsin has lost more than 95% of its dairy farms since 1960 while increasing milk production, replacing a broad base of independent farm families and locally rooted businesses with a narrower set of large operations whose benefits are more concentrated and whose ties to small towns are weaker. Rural Wisconsin's overall population may have risen slightly, in some places may be thriving, but in farm-dependent communities, the collapse of the small dairy farm remains a primary driver of economic and social decline. Section 9. Policy and community paths forward. The damage that dairy consolidation has done to small-town Wisconsin is the result of policy and market choices, not an unavoidable law of nature. The current system rewards maximum volume and the lowest possible cost per unit of milk, even when that undermines family farms and rural communities. Different choices could stabilize milk prices, keep more farms on the land, and rebuild a broad rural middle class. At the national level, the clearest lever is supply management and fair pricing. Supply management means deliberately aligning milk production with what the market can absorb at a price that covers farmers' costs and leaves a reasonable margin. Proposals such as the Milk from Family Dairies Act would set a floor price for milk based on cost of production and limit oversupply so prices do not crash. Advocates describe this as a parity approach, similar to a minimum wage for milk. Earlier crises prompted calls for a floor price around $20 per hundredweight as the level needed to keep farmers on the land and save rural America. By preventing chronic oversupply, such systems would reduce the pressure on small farms to expand endlessly just to survive. Reforming federal milk pricing rules is another key step. The Federal Milk Marketing Order System was designed to set minimum prices and balance power between farmers and processors, but it no longer provides stable, sustainable pay prices for many dairies. Task forces in dairy states have described the system as increasingly ineffective at protecting farmers. In response, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has begun a process to amend pricing provisions, and farm organizations have submitted proposals to update how milk is priced so that producers receive a fairer share of the consumer dollar. If these reforms are crafted with small and mid-sized farms in mind, they can reduce the price volatility that has driven many family dairies out of business. Because so much money in dairy now flows through processors and large buyers, antitrust enforcement and market structure also matter. When processing and retailing are concentrated in a few hands, those firms can squeeze farm gate prices while keeping consumer prices high. Stronger antitrust enforcement, careful review of mergers, and support for cooperatives and independent processors would help ensure that more of the value created in dairy stays with farmers and their communities instead of being captured by a small number of large companies. Alongside national policy changes, direct support for small and mid-sized dairies is essential. State agencies and dairy groups note that about 99% of Wisconsin dairy farms are still family-owned, but family ownership alone does not guarantee that a farm is small or that its benefits are widely shared. Programs that prioritize farms in the 50 to 200 cow range, especially those that derive most of their income from farming, would help recenter the rural middle class. Grants and low-interest loans can support on-farm processing, such as small cheese plants or bottling operations, allowing farms to capture more of the consumer dollar. Technical assistance can help them transition to higher value markets, including grass-based, organic, or specialty products. Tax and credit policies can ease intergenerational transfers so older farmers can retire without selling to the highest bidder, and younger farmers can take over without crippling debt. Community-level strategies can magnify these efforts. Towns like Viroqua show that with enough work, small communities can build new local food economies around smaller farms and artisan processors, turning vacant industrial buildings into hubs for food businesses and revitalizing downtowns by highlighting local products. State and federal rural development programs can help replicate elements of this model by financing shared commercial kitchens, food hubs that aggregate products from many small farms, and farmer-owned retail spaces. Rather than chasing large outside employers that may never arrive, small towns can focus on their agricultural heritage and landscapes as core strengths. Modern infrastructure, especially broadband, is another pillar of any strategy to rebuild rural economies, without embracing consolidation. High-speed internet allows farmers to adopt precision agriculture tools, manage their businesses more efficiently, and sell directly to consumers. A United States Department of Agriculture analysis estimated that expanding rural broadband and fully adopting digital agriculture could create at least $47 billion per year in additional gross benefit for the U.S. economy, with rural broadband connectivity alone accounting for about $18 billion. Of the 24 million Americans without access to fixed broadband providers, roughly 80% live in rural areas. Other studies have found that broadband grants can boost crop productivity by around 9% over several years and strengthen rural growth by enabling remote work and online entrepreneurship. If investments in broadband are designed with small towns and independent farms in mind, they can make it realistic for younger people to live in rural Wisconsin, run businesses, and work remotely instead of moving away. Ultimately, policy and community action need a different yardstick for success. For decades, dairy policy has been judged mainly by how much milk is produced and how low consumer prices are. Under that narrow measure, consolidation can look like a success because it squeezes more milk out of fewer farms at a lower cost. If instead Wisconsin and the broader Midwest measure success by the number of viable family farms, the strength of main streets, the stability of rural schools and churches, and the well-being of farm families, consolidation stands out as a failure. Supply management, fair pricing, modernized milk marketing orders, stronger antitrust enforcement, targeted support for small and mid-sized farms, local food development, and rural broadband all point toward a different future, one where thousands of small, resilient farms again keep wealth, opportunity, and decision-making rooted in the places that produce the food. Section 10, Conclusion. The decline of small-town Wisconsin is not an accident of history or a vague side effect of modernization. It is rooted in the collapse of the small family dairy farm and the consolidation of milk production into far fewer, much larger operations. As these farms have disappeared, the economic and social foundation they provided for rural communities has weakened in step. Jobs have vanished or shifted away. Main streets have lost customers, schools and churches have struggled, and the rural middle class that once centered on independent farm ownership has eroded. Consolidation is often defended as efficient, but the real question is, efficient for whom? The same volume of milk now comes from a narrow tier of large farms and processors, while the costs of this shift, lost livelihoods, hollowed out institutions, environmental strain, and mounting stress on farm families are borne by small towns and the people who live in them. This outcome is not inevitable. It is the result of policies and market rules that reward scale and low farm gate prices over community stability. Because it is the product of choices, it can be changed by choices. If Wisconsin and the broader Midwest want living main streets, stable rural schools, and a broad rural middle class, they cannot treat family-scale farming as a relic of the past. They must make its survival a central economic goal and design policies and local strategies that keep many farms on the land and keep more of the value they create in the communities where they operate. The future of small-town America depends on whether we continue to accept consolidation as inevitable or decide that the health of rural people and places matters more than the relentless drive to get bigger.